A millionaire walked into a shelter to adopt a cat, but took home the wrong one, belonging to a sarcastic barista who refuses to let him go so easily. What happens when the mix-up turns into something neither of them expected? Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Pierce Blackwood adjusted his platinum Rolex as his chauffeur pulled up to the modest brick building on 5th Street. The sign read Pawsome Second Chances Animal Shelter in cheerful yellow letters that made him wince. Everything about this place screamed chaos, the opposite of his controlled world. His suite apartment was a masterpiece of minimalist design. White marble floors so polished you could see your reflection, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, and not a single item out of place. It was featured in Architectural Digest last month with the headline Ice Palace, where perfection meets isolation. The journalist had been more accurate than she'd intended. But lately, the silence had become suffocating. Even his housekeeper, Mrs. Tabitha, commented that the place felt too quiet, like a beautiful tomb. Pierce had dismissed her observation then, but now, standing outside this chaotic animal shelter, he wondered if she'd been right. A cat seemed logical. Cats were independent, clean and quiet, everything he valued. Unlike dogs, they wouldn't demand constant attention or disrupt his carefully scheduled days. They were the perfect solution to his loneliness problem. The shelter's interior assaulted his senses immediately. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something indefinably animal, volunteer voices calling out cheerfully, and the cacophony of barks, meows, and excited chatter. Pierce's jaw tightened as he approached the front desk, where a teenage volunteer with purple hair and multiple piercings smiled brightly. "Hi, are you here to adopt? That's amazing! We have so many wonderful pets looking for forever homes." Pierce nodded curtly, pulling out his phone as it buzzed insistently. "Yes, I need something manageable. A cat. Preferably one that won't cause disruptions." The girl, her name tag read Zoe, tilted her head. "Oh, all our cats are wonderful, but they each have unique personalities. Maybe I could show you around and—" "I'm sorry," Pierce interrupted, holding up a finger as his phone rang. "This is important. Could you just handle the paperwork?" Pierce turned away, diving into a heated conversation with his acquisition team about a tech innovation deal. $1 million decisions required his immediate attention. This cat situation was simple by comparison. He paced near the windows barking orders and negotiating terms while Zoe efficiently handled his adoption forms. "Sir?" Zoe approached tentatively 20 minutes later. "I've got everything ready. This little guy seems perfect for you." Pierce glanced at the gray tabby cat sitting calmly in an expensive carrier he'd had delivered that morning. The cat's green eyes studied him with what seemed like dignified indifference, exactly what he wanted. "Excellent. What's his name?" "This is Marbles," Zoe said, but Pierce was already signing papers while simultaneously texting his assistant about rescheduling his evening calls. "Perfect. Marbles it is." He handed over his platinum American Express without looking at the total. "I assume everything's in order?" Zoe nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. He's going to love his new home. Just remember, cats need time to adjust, so be patient and—" "Right. Thank you." Pierce took the carrier and strode toward the exit, already mentally cataloging where to place the cat supplies his assistant had ordered. Premium food bowls, a state-of-the-art litter system, and outrageously expensive toys. What Pierce didn't notice, and what flustered teenage Zoe realized only after his Bentley disappeared into traffic, was that she'd been preparing a different adoption. Marbles hadn't been available for adoption at all. He was a surrender case, temporarily housed, while his owner desperately searched for affordable housing that allowed pets. The cat Pierce now carried home belonged to someone else entirely. That evening, Pierce stood in his gleaming kitchen, watching Marbles ignore the $300 interactive puzzle feeder he'd purchased. The cat showed zero interest in the designer climbing tree positioned perfectly near the windows, the hand-crafted ceramic food bowls, or even the organic, free-range cat treats that cost more per pound than prime ribeye. Instead, Marbles sat by the door, occasionally letting out soft, confused meows that sounded almost mournful. "You're not impressed by any of this, are you?" Pierce muttered, loosening his Italian silk tie. He'd expected gratitude, or at least curiosity about his luxurious surroundings. Every woman he'd ever dated had been awed by his suite, but this cat seemed utterly unmoved by wealth. Pierce poured himself 2 fingers of 30-year-old scotch and settled into his leather armchair, studying his new companion. "I rescued you from that chaos, you know. This is better, quieter, cleaner, more organized." Marbles fixed him with those unsettling green eyes and meowed once, as if disagreeing. For reasons he couldn't explain, Pierce felt judged. Late in the night, Marbles refused to sleep on the custom-made cat bed, instead curling up on a throw pillow near the door, as if waiting for someone who would never come. Pierce found himself watching the cat instead of reviewing quarterly reports, unsettled by the creature's obvious melancholy. At 3 a.m., lying in his emperor-sized bed, Pierce listened to Marbles pacing the floors. The sound echoed through the cavernous space, highlighting just how empty his life had become. When was the last time he'd heard laughter in these rooms? When had he last shared a meal with another person? He'd worked 18-hour days for 15 years, building his real empire from nothing. He owned half the downtown district, had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, and commanded respect from everyone he met. But lying there in the darkness listening to a lonely cat pace his lonely apartment, Pierce wondered what exactly he'd won. The next morning brought answers he hadn't expected. Pierce was reviewing acquisition reports over his usual breakfast of steel-cut oats and perfectly brewed Ethiopian coffee when building security called. "Mr. Blackwood, there's a situation in the lobby. A young woman demanding to see you. She's quite insistent." Pierce frowned. "I don't have any appointments this morning, handle it." "Sir, she claims you stole her cat. She's refusing to leave and frankly, she's causing quite a scene. The other residents are starting to complain." "Stole her cat?" Pierce glanced at Marbles, who was sitting by the window, staring down at the street with what looked like hopeful anticipation. "Send her up." 3 minutes later, his doorbell rang with the aggression of machine gun fire. Pierce opened the door to find a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a different universe entirely. Riley Hart stood about 5'6" in scuffed combat boots that had seen better years. Her jeans were artfully torn, not designer distressed, but genuinely worn from use. Her vintage band t-shirt hung loose over her frame, and her dark hair was pulled into a bun secured with what appeared to be a pencil. She clutched a chipped ceramic travel mug that read, "World's Okayest Human," and emanated an energy that made Pierce's organized world feel suddenly fragile. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Fierce brown eyes that blazed with righteous fury and something deeper. Pain, maybe. Desperation. "That's my cat, you over-polished man-sculpture," she declared, pointing past him toward Marbles. At the sound of her voice, Marbles launched himself from the window perch and streaked across the marble floor, weaving around Pierce's legs to reach her. The cat's entire mood transformed, from listless and confused to vibrant and joyful as he wound around Riley's ankles, purring like a small motor. Pierce stared at the reunion, pieces clicking into place. "There's been some mistake." "No kidding, Sherlock." Riley scooped up Marbles, who immediately began headbutting her chin with obvious affection. "This is Marbles. He's been my family for 3 years. And yesterday, some pompous millionaire with more money than sense waltzed into the shelter and just took him." "I adopted him legally," Pierce said stiffly, though he was beginning to understand the scope of the error. "I have paperwork." Riley's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, I'm sure your paperwork is perfect, probably gold-leafed and notarized by God himself. But here's the thing." She stepped closer, and Pierce caught a whiff of coffee beans and something warm, like vanilla. I didn't surrender him. I was temporarily boarding him while I found a new apartment. The shelter knew he wasn't available for adoption. Pierce's business mind immediately began calculating solutions. I'll write you a check. What's he worth? A few hundred? 1,000? The silence that followed was so profound Pierce could hear his own heartbeat. Riley's expression shifted from anger to something approaching disgust. You think you can Venmo your way out of catnapping? Her voice was dangerously quiet. This isn't a business transaction, you absolute walnut. This is my family. Pierce had faced down corporate sharks, hostile takeovers, and billion-dollar negotiations without flinching. But something about this woman's fury made him feel oddly small. I'm offering to compensate you for the inconvenience. The inconvenience? Riley's voice cracked slightly. I spent last night walking the streets calling his name until my voice gave out. I thought I'd lost him forever because I couldn't afford pet deposits at new apartments. I thought. She stopped, pressing her face into Marble's fur. Pierce saw her shoulders shake and felt an unfamiliar tightening in his chest. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steel. You want to make this right? You'll bring him back to me personally. Not your assistant, not your driver, not some courier service. You. Tomorrow morning you'll carry him to my cafe and apologize for turning my life upside down. Your cafe? Grind Coffee, on Maple Street. You know, where us peasants work for a living. She kissed the top of Marble's head. I'll let you keep him tonight since he seems comfortable, but tomorrow you make this right. In person. Pierce opened his mouth to object, but Riley was already heading toward the door. Oh, and Pierce, she turned back, somehow knowing his name, though he hadn't introduced himself. Where's something less? You'll scare the regular humans. The door closed with a sharp click, leaving Pierce alone with the lingering scent of coffee and vanilla, and the disturbing realization that no one had spoken to him like that in over a decade. He looked at Marbles, who was back to sitting by the door, meowing softly. She's completely unreasonable, Pierce told the cat. I could have that entire block condemned if I wanted to. Marbles meowed again, and Pierce could have sworn it sounded judgmental. That night, Pierce found himself Googling Grind Coffee Maple Street, instead of reviewing property assessments. The cafe's website was amateur, but charming, filled with photos of mismatched furniture, local art on the walls, and customers who looked genuinely happy. One photo showed Riley behind the counter, laughing at something off-camera, and Pierce found himself staring at her smile, far longer than was professional. He was a man who controlled million-dollar empires, who commanded respect from senators and CEOs. He didn't get ordered around by baristas with attitude problems and combat boots. But as he watched Marbles curl up on that same throw pillow, clearly pining for his real owner, Pierce realized he was going to do exactly what Riley Hart had demanded. And he had no idea why that terrified him so much. Pierce had owned the same wardrobe for 5 years. Perfectly tailored suits in navy and black, handmade Italian shoes that cost more than most cars, and shirts pressed perfectly. Standing in his walk-in closet the next morning, staring at rows of identical perfection, he finally understood Riley's criticism. He wore armor to work every day, expensive, intimidating armor designed to keep the world at arm's length. For reasons he couldn't explain, Pierce found himself reaching for a pair of dark jeans he'd bought on impulse years ago and never worn, and a simple gray sweater that felt foreign against his skin. He looked like a different person in the mirror, younger, less imposing, almost approachable. Marbles watched from the carrier as Pierce called his driver. Actually, James, I'll drive myself today. Sir, are you feeling well? Pierce ignored the question, grabbing keys to the Audi he'd bought but rarely used. 30 minutes later he stood outside Grind Coffee, carrier in hand, feeling more nervous than he had before his first board presentation. The cafe was everything his suite wasn't. Warm, lived in, chaotic in the most appealing way. Mismatched furniture created cozy conversation nooks, local artwork covered exposed brick walls, and the scent of fresh roasted coffee beans wrapped around him like a hug. Soft indie music played from speakers he couldn't see, and customers chatted at comfortable volumes, their laptops and books spread across wooden tables scarred with years of use. It felt like home, though Pierce couldn't remember ever having a home that felt this welcoming. Riley stood behind the espresso machine, her back to the door, dark hair escaping from a messy ponytail as she worked. She wore faded jeans and a forest green sweater that looked soft enough to touch, and Pierce found himself wondering what it would feel like under his fingers. The thought startled him so much he nearly dropped the carrier. "Riley," he called out, his voice rougher than intended. She turned, and her face cycled through surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been approval as she took in his changed appearance. Well, well. The corporate overlord owns casual clothes, who knew? But her tone was less sharp than yesterday, and Pierce caught the hint of a smile before she suppressed it. Customers were starting to stare, recognizing him from newspaper photos. Pierce felt exposed without his usual suit of armor. "I brought marbles," he said unnecessarily, lifting the carrier. Riley softened as she moved around the counter. "Hey baby boy," she cooed, opening the carrier door. Marbles emerged with an ecstatic purr, immediately winding around her legs in figure eights of pure joy. Watching them together, Pierce felt that strange tightening in his chest again. When was the last time anyone had been that happy to see him? "Thank you," Riley said quietly, picking up marbles and accepting his enthusiastic head bonks. "I know this probably feels stupid to you, but—" "It doesn't," Pierce found himself saying. "Feels stupid, I mean. He's obviously important to you." Riley studied his face as if looking for sarcasm. Finding none, she nodded toward an empty table in the corner. "Sit, I'll make you something." "I should go?" "Sit," not a request this time. Pierce sat. The cafe bustled around them. Riley taking orders with easy banter. Customers laughing at her quick wit. The comfortable rhythm of a place where people belonged. Pierce watched her work, noting the way she remembered regular customers, orders without being told, how she asked about their families, their jobs, their lives. She cared about these people. Actually cared, not in the calculated way Pierce used charm to close deals, but genuinely. When she finally brought him a coffee, in a proper ceramic mug, not a paper cup, Pierce took a sip and nearly groaned with pleasure. It was perfect. Rich, complex, with hints of chocolate and something he couldn't identify. "Good?" Riley asked, sliding into the chair across from him. Marbles immediately claimed her lap, settling in like he'd never left. "Exceptional," Pierce admitted. "Where did you learn to make coffee?" Riley's eyebrow arched. "Probably the same place you learned to buy and sell buildings. Practice." They sat in silence for a moment, Pierce, acutely aware of how out of place he felt, and how perfectly Riley fit into this warm, chaotic world. "I looked into what happened," he said finally. "At the shelter. It was a genuine mistake." "I know." Riley scratched behind Marbles' ears, not meeting Pierce's eyes. "Zoe called me crying. Apparently she was so flustered by your intensity that she grabbed the wrong paperwork." "My intensity?" Riley's smile was slight but genuine. "You have a very commanding presence, Pierce Blackwood. Rumor has it you once made a city councilman wet himself during a zoning meeting." "That's completely untrue," Pierce said, then paused. He only teared up a little. The laugh that escaped Riley transformed her entire face, and Pierce felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of something that had been tight for so long, he'd forgotten it was there. "So what's your story?" Riley asked suddenly. Why did the big bad real estate mogul suddenly decide he needed a cat? The question was casual, but Pierce sensed she was really asking something deeper. He found himself wanting to answer honestly, though honesty had never been his strong suit in personal conversations. "I live in a museum," he said finally. "Beautiful, expensive, perfectly designed, and completely lifeless. I thought maybe a cat might make it feel less like a mausoleum." Riley's expression softened. And I realized I don't know the first thing about taking care of anything that can't be bought or intimidated into compliance. Hence the $300 puzzle feeder that Marbles completely ignored. Pierce's cheeks warmed. "You saw that?" "I saw the credit card statement you left on your counter," Riley said with a grin. "Also the climbing tree that costs more than my rent, and the organic treats that are probably more nutritious than what I eat most days." "I wanted to do it right," Pierce said quietly. Something in his tone made Riley study his face more carefully. "You did do it right, in your own way. You just, maybe overthought it a little." They fell into easy conversation then. Pierce asking about the cafe, Riley telling stories about her regulars, both of them avoiding the obvious question hanging between them. What happens now? When Pierce finally looked at his watch, he realized he'd been there for 2 hours. His assistant had probably sent 17 texts about missed meetings. "I should go," he said reluctantly, though he made no move to leave. Riley nodded, but didn't stand. Marbles had fallen asleep in her lap, purring softly. "Thank you," she said again, "for bringing him back, for staying, for not being as terrible as I expected." "What did you expect?" Riley's smile turned mischievous. "Horns, maybe. A forked tail. Definitely more sneering." Pierce laughed. Actually laughed, and the sound surprised them both. As he finally stood to leave, Riley called after him. "Pierce, you're welcome here any time. I mean it." Walking back to his car, Pierce felt strangely reluctant to return to his scheduled life of meetings and acquisitions and perfectly organized emptiness. For 2 hours, he'd existed in Riley's world of warmth and laughter and genuine human connection. He wanted more. That thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like waking up after a very long sleep. Pierce told himself he was just checking on Marbles when he returned to grind coffee 3 days later. Then again on Friday. By the following Tuesday he'd established what could generously be called a routine, and more accurately be called an obsession. Each morning, he'd stop by before work, ostensibly for coffee but really to watch Riley work her magic with customers, to hear her laugh at regulars, jokes, to see the way she lit up when Marbles would venture out from behind the counter to accept scratches from particularly favored patrons. He learned that Riley arrived at 5 a.m. to prep, that she knew every customer's name and drink preference, that she sketched on napkins during slow periods, and that she had a laugh that could make him forget about quarterly reports and acquisition deadlines. He also learned that she was struggling. It started with small observations. The way she'd check her phone anxiously during quiet moments, the dark circles under her eyes, the occasional flash of worry when she thought no one was looking. Then Pierce started noticing bigger things, equipment that needed repair but wasn't getting it, suppliers, bills stacked behind the register, the stress lines around Riley's eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Pierce was a problem solver by nature. It's what made him successful in business. He saw inefficiencies and fixed them, identified needs and filled them, recognized opportunities and seized them. So when he noticed the ancient espresso machine sputtering and producing inconsistent shots, he knew exactly how to help. Riley was wiping down tables after the morning rush when Pierce approached the counter, pulling out his checkbook. "I'd like to buy you a new espresso machine," he announced without preamble. Riley froze, dish rag suspended mid-air. "Excuse me? Your machine is dying. I can hear it struggling from across the room, and I've watched you bang on it 3 times this morning just to get decent crema. A new commercial-grade machine would improve efficiency, consistency, and customer satisfaction." Riley slowly straightened, and Pierce recognized the dangerous quiet in her voice. "How much?" "The model I have in mind runs about $15,000, but it would pay for itself within $15,000. Riley's voice rose enough to make nearby customers glance over. Are you completely insane? Pierce frowned, confused by her reaction. It's a reasonable business investment. I could have it installed by tomorrow. Stop. Riley held up a hand, her face cycling through emotions Pierce couldn't read. Just stop talking for a second. She walked around the counter to face him directly, and Pierce noticed her hands were shaking slightly. You think I'm some charity case, she said quietly. Poor little barista can't afford nice equipment, so the rich man swoops in to save the day. That's not. You think everyone has a price tag, don't you? Riley's voice was getting louder, and Pierce became acutely aware they had an audience. Newsflash. Trust fund, baby. Not everything can be bought. Not everyone wants to be rescued by your Platinum American Express. I was trying to help, by throwing money at me like I'm some kind of problem to be solved. Riley's eyes were bright with angry tears. I've been running this place for 3 years. I built it from nothing. And yes, it's small, and yes, the equipment is old, but it's mine. I don't need you to fix me. Pierce felt heat rise in his face, embarrassment and frustration in equal measure. I wasn't trying to fix you, I was trying to, what? Make yourself feel better about having more money than you know what to do with. Riley wiped her eyes roughly. Here's a thought. Maybe I don't want your help. Maybe I don't want to be another acquisition in your portfolio. The words hit Pierce, partly because they stung, and partly because they contained enough truth to cut deep. That's not what this is, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Riley laughed bitterly. Isn't it? You see something you want, my cafe, my gratitude, maybe me, so you figure out how to buy it. Well, congratulations, Pierce. You've just learned that some things aren't for sale. She turned away, busying herself with unnecessary tasks behind the counter. Pierce stood there for a moment, acutely aware of every customer pretending not to stare, feeling more exposed than he had in his entire adult life. Riley, I think you should go, she said without turning around. And maybe don't come back for a while. Pierce left without another word, his face burning with shame and confusion. In his car, he sat gripping the steering wheel, trying to understand what had just happened. He'd been trying to help. The machine was dying, the cafe could benefit from newer equipment, and he did have the resources to make it happen easily. In his world, problems had solutions, and solutions usually involved money. But as he replayed Riley's words, Pierce began to recognize the deeper issue. He had been trying to fix her, or at least fix her circumstances so he could feel better about wanting to be part of her world. He'd reduced her struggle to a problem he could solve with a check, never considering what that struggle might mean to her sense of independence and pride. For the first time in his adult life, Pierce Blackwood had offered someone everything he had to give, and it hadn't been nearly enough. 3 days passed before Pierce worked up the courage to drive by Grind Coffee again. He didn't go in, just sat in his car across the street, watching Riley work through the windows like a stalker. She looked tired, and the espresso machine was definitely getting worse, but she was managing. She was strong and capable, and completely, utterly independent. Everything he wasn't, Pierce realized, everything he'd forgotten how to be. That night, alone in his perfect empty suite, Pierce found himself wondering when he'd become the kind of man who thought money could solve everything. When had he lost the ability to offer anything else? And more importantly, was it too late to learn? Pierce stayed away from Grind Coffee for 2 weeks, throwing himself into work with the obsessive intensity that had built his empire. He closed some deals, and increased his net worth by several $1 million. None of it filled the Riley-shaped hole in his days. He told himself he was respecting her wishes. She'd asked him to stay away, and he was honoring that. But deep down, Pierce knew he was hiding, from his feelings, from his mistakes, and from the uncomfortable truth that Riley Hart had shown him about himself. The truth came crashing down on a rainy Thursday evening when Pierce's assistant handed him a stack of eviction notices for his legal team to process. "Standard 30-day notices for the Maple Street properties," she said efficiently. "The whole block's being cleared for the Meridian development." Pierce glanced at the addresses without really seeing them until one made him freeze. 847 Maple Street. He knew that address. Riley's building. Pierce's hands shook slightly as he flipped through the tenant list. Riley Hart, Unit 3B. Monthly rent, $800. Reason for eviction: property redevelopment. The Meridian Project. Pierce's newest acquisition, a $30 million development that would transform an entire city block into luxury condominiums and high-end retail. He'd been planning it for 18 months. Had purchased every building on the block through shell companies, and was systematically clearing tenants to make way for demolition, including Riley. Pierce's stomach dropped as memories crashed together. Riley mentioning rent hikes and apartment hunting, her desperate search for pet-friendly housing, the reason she'd temporarily boarded Marbles in the first place. She'd been displaced by his own company's aggressive acquisition strategy. He was the reason she'd almost lost her cat. He was the reason she worked 18-hour days and couldn't afford new equipment. He was the monster who'd turned her life upside down, and then had the audacity to offer to fix it with money. Pierce grabbed his coat and ran. The rain was coming down hard by the time he reached Grind Coffee, soaking through his wool coat and plastering his hair to his skull. Through the windows he could see Riley closing up, moving around the empty cafe with Marbles weaving between her feet. He knocked on the door, water dripping from his nose. Riley looked up, startled. Then her face cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been concern when she saw his disheveled state. "We're closed," she called through the glass. "I know about your apartment," Pierce shouted back, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I know why you almost lost Marbles." Riley's face went white. Slowly she walked to the door and turned the lock. Pierce stumbled inside, dripping on the worn wooden floors, trying to find words for the enormity of what he'd discovered. "It was me," he said finally. "Your building, the eviction notice, it's my company. I'm the reason you're losing your home." Riley stared at him for a long moment, then sank into the nearest chair like her legs had given out. "Your company," she repeated quietly. "Blackwood Development. We use shell corporations for acquisitions, so tenants don't know." Pierce stopped, realizing how that sounded. "It's not personal. It's never personal. It's just business." "Just business," Riley echoed, and Pierce heard something breaking in her voice. "I didn't know you lived there. I swear, Riley, I didn't know. The eviction notices just came across my desk tonight, and when I saw your name—" "How long?" Riley asked. "What? How long have you owned my building?" Pierce's throat felt tight. 18 months. Riley's face crumpled, then hardened into something Pierce had never seen before. Pure, undiluted rage. 18 months, she whispered. "You've been systematically destroying my neighborhood for 18 months. Buying up buildings, raising rents, forcing out families who've lived here for generations. And then," her voice rose to a shout, "then you waltz into my cafe playing the charming Millionaire, offering to buy me coffee machines, acting like you're some kind of savior. Riley, I didn't know. You didn't know." She shot to her feet and Pierce instinctively stepped backward. "You didn't know that your actions have consequences? That every building you buy and every family you displace are real people with real lives?" Marbles, sensing the tension, disappeared behind the counter. "Mrs. Tamsin in 3A has lived in that building for 30 years, Riley continued, tears streaming down her face. "The Caspians downstairs just had a baby. Old Mr. Peterson lost his wife last year, and that apartment is all he has left of her. But none of that matters to you, does it? Because it's just business." Pierce felt like he was drowning in the weight of her pain. Pain he had caused, blindly and carelessly, and with complete indifference to the human cost of his ambition. "You don't just steal cats," Riley said, her voice breaking. You steal homes, you steal communities, you steal people's whole worlds, and then you sleep peacefully in your ivory tower because you've never had to watch the consequences of your choices. Pierce opened his mouth to defend himself, to explain about market forces and development cycles and the inevitable march of progress, but the words died in his throat. Because Riley was right, he'd spent so many years insulated from the human cost of his business decisions, that he'd forgotten people lived in the buildings he bought and sold like chess pieces. I can fix this, he said desperately. I can stop the evictions, find you all new places. Riley's laugh was harsh and brittle. With what? More money? More strings attached to make yourself feel better? She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't want your guilt money, Pierce. I want you to leave. Riley, please. Get out. The words echoed through the empty cafe, bouncing off the brick walls and hitting Pierce. Get out and stay out. I never want to see you again. Pierce stood there for a moment, water still dripping from his soaked clothes, watching the woman he was falling for look at him like he was everything wrong with the world. Because maybe he was. He turned and walked back into the rain, leaving Riley alone with her tears and her cat, and the life he'd inadvertently shattered. By the time Pierce reached his car, he was crying too. Ugly sobs that came from somewhere so deep he didn't know it existed. He'd built an empire on the foundation of other people's displacement, convinced himself it was just business, just progress, just the natural order of things. But watching Riley's face as she realized the scope of his betrayal, Pierce finally understood the true cost of his success, and he had no idea how to live with it. Pierce didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his pristine living room, staring out at the city lights, and thinking about Mrs. Tamsin's 30 years of memories, about the Caspian family's new baby, about Mr. Peterson's grief-filled apartment that would soon be demolished for luxury condos. By dawn he'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. Pierce called an emergency board meeting for 8 a.m., striding into the conference room, still wearing yesterday's wrinkled clothes. His board members, gray-haired men in expensive suits who'd helped him build his empire, stared at him with unconcealed concern. Pierce, you look terrible, his CFO said. Are you ill? I'm canceling the Meridian project, Pierce announced without preamble. Silence followed. I'm sorry, what? His lead attorney leaned forward. Did you say canceling? We've invested $30 million in acquisitions alone. I said what I said. Pierce's voice was steel. We're canceling Meridian, effective immediately. Pierce. His business partner David spoke carefully, as if addressing someone having a breakdown. This project represents 18 months of work. We have contracts, commitments, investors expecting returns. Then we'll pay the penalties. Break the contracts. Return the investments. Pierce met each of their shocked faces. And we're implementing a new policy. No more residential displacement without tenant relocation assistance. Full moving expenses. First year's rent at comparable properties. Job placement help if needed. That's millions in additional costs per project, the CFO sputtered. Then we build it into our budgets. David stood up, his face flushed. Pierce, I understand you're going through something, but you can't run a business on emotions. Can't I? Pierce's voice was dangerously quiet. I built this company. I can run it however I choose. And I choose not to destroy people's lives for profit anymore. The room erupted in arguments, voices overlapping as board members cited fiduciary duty, shareholder expectations, and market realities. Pierce listened to their protests with growing clarity about how far he'd drifted from any sense of basic human decency. Gentlemen, he said finally, his voice cutting through the chaos. You have two choices. Adapt to our new ethical standards or find new jobs. The meeting is adjourned. Pierce walked out, leaving behind a conference room full of sputtering millionaires who'd never seen him prioritize anything over profit. But canceling one project wasn't enough. Pierce spent the next 3 days systematically reviewing every Blackwood development acquisition, every pending eviction, every family his company had displaced in the name of progress. The scope of it was staggering. Hundreds of people over the years pushed out of their homes to make way for his vision of a more profitable city. He couldn't undo all of it, but he could start making it right. Pierce personally called every tenant facing eviction in the Maple Street buildings, offering full relocation assistance and compensation packages that left most of them speechless. Mrs. Tamsin cried when he promised to help her find a new apartment with the same rent she'd been paying for 30 years. The Caspians asked him to repeat his offer 3 times, certain they'd misunderstood. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. The real work began when Pierce showed up at Grind Coffee at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, carrying a toolbox he'd bought the night before. Riley was prepping for the morning rush, her back to the door when he knocked. She turned, saw him through the glass, and her face immediately hardened. "We're closed," she mouthed. Pierce held up a wrench. "I know, I'm here to fix your sink." Riley stared at him for a long moment, then reluctantly unlocked the door. "I didn't ask you to fix my sink. It's been dripping for weeks, I noticed." Pierce stepped inside, acutely aware of how unwelcome he was. "Also, your espresso machine is making that grinding sound again, and I think I know what's wrong." "Pierce, I'm not here to buy you anything," he said quickly. "I'm here to work, to help. With my hands, not my wallet." Riley crossed her arms, studying him with suspicious eyes. "And why would you do that?" Pierce met her gaze steadily. "Because I need to learn how to be useful in ways that don't involve writing checks. Because I need to understand what it means to actually contribute something to the world besides profit margins." "And you think fixing my sink is going to absolve you of destroying my neighborhood?" "No," Pierce said quietly. "I think it's going to teach me the difference between helping and buying, between contributing and consuming, between being part of a community and just owning pieces of it." Riley was quiet for a long moment, absently scratching marbles behind the ears. The cat had emerged from behind the counter and was winding around Pierce's legs with obvious affection. "One morning," she said finally, "you can fix what's broken, but then you leave, and if you try to pay me for coffee or pastries, I'll throw you out myself." Pierce nodded gratefully and got to work. The sink repair should have taken 20 minutes. It took Pierce 2 hours because he had no idea what he was doing. Riley watched with poorly concealed amusement as he wrestled with pipes, soaked himself with spray from loose connections, and cursed at stubborn bolts in languages he didn't know he knew, but eventually the dripping stopped. "Not bad for a pampered rich boy," Riley said grudgingly, and Pierce felt absurdly proud of her faint praise. He came back the next day to work on the espresso machine, then to fix a wobbling table, then to replace a burnt-out light fixture that had been flickering for months. Each morning Pierce showed up early with tools and YouTube tutorials downloaded to his phone, learning through trial and error how to be useful with his hands instead of his bank account. Riley maintained her distance, but Pierce caught her hiding smiles when he inevitably did something clumsy or got covered in coffee grounds while cleaning the grinder. The real breakthrough came on Friday morning when Riley's opening barista called in sick, leaving her alone during the morning rush. Pierce watched her struggle to manage orders, work the espresso machine, and handle the register simultaneously, customers growing impatient as the line backed up. "Let me help," he said impulsively. "You don't know how." "I can learn, please." Riley hesitated, then thrust an apron at him. "Fine. But if you mess up someone's order, you're buying their coffee for a month." Pierce tied on the apron, bright pink with "World's Okayest Barista" embroidered across the front, and dove in. He was predictably terrible at first. He fumbled with the register, steamed milk into frothy disasters, and mixed up orders so thoroughly that Riley had to remake half the drinks he attempted. But the customers were surprisingly patient, charmed by the sight of Pierce Blackwood, whose face had graced the business section of newspapers for years, struggling to master the art of cappuccino foam. "Is that really Pierce Blackwood?" one regular whispered to another. "The millionaire guy?" "Making my latte," her friend whispered back. "And making it wrong, but still." By the end of the rush, Pierce was exhausted, covered in milk foam and grinning like an idiot. He'd never worked so hard for so little money in his life, and it felt incredible. "You're really bad at this," Riley said, but she was almost smiling. "I'll get better," Pierce promised, "if you'll let me keep trying." Riley studied his face, flushed with exertion, bright with genuine happiness, and something in her expression softened. "We'll see." Over the following weeks, Pierce established a routine that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. Up at 5 a.m. to help Riley prep. 6 hours making coffee, learning customers, names, wiping tables, and discovering muscles he didn't know he had. Then off to manage his actual business, which he was learning to run with a conscience. The customers loved having him there, not because he was a celebrity, but because he was genuinely trying. Mrs. Patterson taught him how to make her perfect chai latte. College student Jake showed him the proper way to clean the espresso machine. Even the most difficult customers seemed charmed by Pierce's earnest incompetence and determination to improve. But it was Riley's gradual thaw that kept him coming back. She started trusting him with more complex tasks, then including him in her banter with regulars, then actually laughing at his jokes instead of just rolling her eyes. Pierce found himself living for those moments when Riley forgot to be angry with him and just enjoyed his company. 3 weeks into his cafe apprenticeship, Pierce arrived to find Riley sitting alone at a corner table, sketching in a worn notebook. She quickly closed it when she saw him, but not before he caught a glimpse of her drawing, the cafe but transformed, with expanded seating and a small stage in one corner. "What was that?" he asked gently. Riley flushed. "Nothing. Just silly dreams." "Dreams aren't silly. What kind of dreams?" Riley was quiet for so long, Pierce thought she wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, she opened the notebook again. "I've always wanted to expand," she said softly. "Add evening hours, maybe have live music on weekends. Local artists, open mic nights. Turn this place into a real community hub instead of just a coffee shop." Pierce studied her sketches. Detailed, thoughtful plans that would transform grind coffee into something magical. "These are incredible, Riley." "Why haven't you?" "Because dreams require money, and I don't have money," she said with forced lightness. "I can barely keep the lights on as it is." Pierce felt the familiar urge to solve her problem with his checkbook, but he'd learned enough to recognize the impulse and suppress it. Instead, he asked, "What would you need to make this happen?" Riley laughed bitterly. "About $50,000 I don't have. New equipment, renovation costs, permits, insurance. It's impossible." "What if it wasn't about money?" Riley looked at him skeptically. "Everything's about money, Pierce. What if it was about community instead? What if the people who love this place wanted to help make it better?" "I don't follow." Pierce's mind was racing, but for once not toward financial solutions. Crowdfunding. Community investment. Local musicians who'd play for tips and exposure, artists who'd donate time for the chance to display their work, contractors who'd work for coffee and good karma. Riley stared at him. "You think people would actually do that?" "I think people love this place almost as much as you do," Pierce said honestly. "And I think they'd love to be part of making it even better." For the first time in weeks, Riley smiled at him. Really smiled, bright and hopeful and beautiful. "You know what?" she said. "Let's find out." 6 months later, Pierce stood behind the espresso machine at Grind Coffee's grand reopening, wearing his pink, world's okayest barista apron, and trying not to burn the milk for Mrs. Patterson's chai latte. Again. The expansion had worked beyond Riley's wildest dreams. The community had rallied in ways that restored Pierce's faith in humanity. Contractors working for cost, local artists donating labor, customers contributing everything from painting skills to vintage furniture. The small stage Riley had sketched was now real, built by a carpenter, whose daughter Riley had tutored through high school. The expanded seating area buzzed with conversation and laughter. "Behind you, hot coffee," Riley called, sliding past him with a tray of drinks. She bumped his hip playfully as she passed, and Pierce felt the same flutter in his chest he'd been experiencing for months. Tonight was open mic night, the culmination of Riley's vision for Grind Coffee as a community gathering place. Local musicians filled the calendar for months in advance, and the evening crowds had become as loyal as the morning regulars. Pierce had learned to make a decent cappuccino, could work the register without major disasters, and knew every customer's name and story. More importantly, he'd learned the difference between helping and controlling, between contributing and consuming, between being part of something and trying to own it. His real estate company still made money, more than ever, actually, since their ethical practices had attracted investors who valued social responsibility. But Pierce no longer measured his worth by his net worth. These days, his proudest moments came from perfectly steamed milk foam, and Riley's approving nods when he remembered a customer's usual order without being asked. "You're getting good at this," Riley said during a brief lull, leaning against the counter beside him. She wore a vintage dress in deep blue that made her eyes look like starlight, and Pierce had to remind himself to breathe. "I have a good teacher," he said. "The best teacher is experience. And you've definitely had a lot of experience screwing up drink orders." Pierce laughed, bumping her shoulder with his. "Remember my first week? When I somehow made that woman's cappuccino taste like soap?" "You put dish soap in the milk steamer," Riley giggled. "I still don't understand how that even happened." "Neither do I, but she was very polite about it." "She was terrified. You were Pierce Blackwood, making her coffee. She probably thought criticizing your technique would get her evicted." Pierce's smile faltered slightly. He'd never quite gotten used to how his reputation preceded him, though he was working to change it one perfect latte at a time. Riley noticed his mood shift and touched his arm gently. "Hey, you're not that person anymore. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really changed, or if I just got better at pretending." Riley turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "Pierce, you spent your Saturday helping Mr. Peterson move into his new apartment. You worked a double shift last week when Jamie's kid was sick. You convinced your entire board of directors to implement ethical housing practices that cost your company millions in profit. Anyone would have." "No," Riley interrupted firmly. "Anyone wouldn't have. Most people in your position would have written a check and called it charity. You dismantled your entire business model and rebuilt it around treating people like human beings instead of obstacles to profit." Pierce looked into her eyes, seeing himself reflected there. Not the cold businessman he'd been, but the man he was still learning to become. "I had good motivation," he said softly. Riley's cheeks pinked. "Yeah. What's that?" "I wanted to become someone worthy of you." The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying. Pierce held his breath, wondering if he'd finally said too much. Riley's smile started slowly, then bloomed across her face like sunrise. "You know what, Pierce Blackwood?" "What?" "I think you already are." Before Pierce could respond, Riley rose on her tiptoes and kissed him, soft and sweet and tasting like the cinnamon latte she'd been perfecting all day. Pierce's hands found her waist, pulling her closer, and for a moment the busy cafe disappeared around them. When they broke apart, both breathless, Pierce rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable. "I love you too," Riley whispered back. "Even if you still can't make foam art to save your life." Pierce laughed, spinning her around right there behind the counter, while customers applauded and marbles wound around their feet, purring loudly enough to be heard over the evening's first musical act, tuning their guitars. Later that night, after the last customer had gone and they'd cleaned up together, Pierce and Riley sat curled on the old couch in the back corner, sharing a piece of the chocolate cake Mrs. Tamsin had brought to celebrate the expansion. Marbles sprawled across both their laps, finally getting the attention he deserved from both his humans. "You know what's funny?" Riley said, feeding Pierce a bite of cake. "If you hadn't accidentally stolen my cat, none of this would have happened." Pierce considered this, stroking Marbles' fur and watching the contentment on Riley's face. "Best mistake I ever made." "Second best," Riley corrected. "What was the first?" Riley grinned. "Thinking you could buy your way into my good graces with a $15,000 espresso machine," Pierce groaned. "Are you ever going to let me live that down?" "Never. It's too perfect. My boyfriend, the reformed millionaire who tried to purchase my affection with overpriced coffee equipment." "Boyfriend?" Pierce raised an eyebrow, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. Riley's cheeks turned pink again. "Is that okay?" Instead of answering, Pierce kissed her again, deeper this time, tasting possibility and promise and the kind of future he'd never known he wanted. When they finally came up for air, both of them laughing and breathless, Pierce looked around the cafe, at the community art on the walls, the mismatched furniture that somehow felt perfect, the stage where dreams came alive every night, the warm space that Riley had built with love and determination and very little money. It was everything his sterile penthouse wasn't, lived in, imperfect, full of heart and history and hope. "I have a confession," he said suddenly. Riley raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" "I've been thinking about selling the suite." "Really? Why?" Pierce looked into her eyes, seeing his future reflected there, messy and wonderful and completely different from anything he'd planned. "Because home isn't a place," he said softly. "It's a person. And I want to wake up every morning knowing I get to make terrible coffee with my favorite person in the world." Riley's eyes filled with happy tears. "Even if that person will never let you live down your foam art failures." "Especially then." As if he understood the moment's significance, Marbles stretched and purred louder, claiming both their laps and their hearts, with typical feline confidence. Pierce laughed, scratching behind the cat's ears. "Who would have thought the wrong cat would lead me to the right person?" Riley settled against Pierce's shoulder, perfectly content. Maybe he wasn't the wrong cat after all. Maybe he was exactly the right cat, bringing exactly the right person into my chaotic world at exactly the right time. Pierce wrapped his arms around them both, Riley warm and solid against his side, Marbles purring between them, and realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was completely, utterly, perfectly home. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace of ambition and acquisition, but inside grind coffee, three hearts beat in contented rhythm, proving that the best things in life really couldn't be bought. They could only be earned, one imperfect cup of coffee at a time.